The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I call the member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Every child has the right to a good quality public education. To make that happen, public schools need money now. Not in 2019 or at some unspecified date in the future, but now. To even match the OECD average, Australia would need right now to put in an additional $7 billion into education. Australia's public investment in all education is 3.7% compared to the OECD average of 5%. In relation to public expenditure on schools, we rank 24 out of 30, with Australia's public investment at 3.0% compared to an OECD average of 3.5%. By OECD standards, only Belgium and Chile spend a smaller proportion of money on public schools than Australia, and only Belgium, Chile and Israel spend a higher proportion on private schools. And what we know is that this current inequity in funding hits disadvantaged public schools the hardest, as was reported in The Australian. Over the last 7 years, public funding of independent schools has increased by 82% and for Catholic schools by 64%, but for public schools only 48%. Why are we in this position? Well, we are in this position because the previous Howard government put in place a very unfair funding model. And it was a model that didn't take into account the streams of private recurrent income from sources other than fees, such as endowments, donations and capital works loan schemes. It was a funding model that gives, or it is a funding model that gives an advantage to schools in regional areas and those with high proportion of country students, leading to some wealthy city boarding schools receiving lower SES rankings, such as Geelong Grammar. And the funding given to schools with high SES scores was disproportionately generous compared to schools at the lower end of the scale. Now, that funding model has been in place for a number of years and has led to us having now the distinction of being near the bottom of the heap in developed countries when it comes to our spending on public schools. For many years, the Greens have said we need to fix this. The Greens know that public education is a cornerstone of democracy. The Greens firmly believe that every child has a right to a good quality public education. And when Gonski reforms a report came along, we said, well, it's well overdue, let's get on with it. We find ourselves in a situation where 5 minutes to midnight, with only a few months to run on this parliament, we still have not fixed the unfair Howard funding model. Labor has had so many chances to fix this problem. At the early stage of its government, it had the advantage of having almost wall-to-wall state Labor premiers with whom it could have worked to fix the John Howard unfair funding model. And instead, Labor came to this parliament and said, no, we want to extend it because we're not ready to fix it yet. And as a result, a child who was in grade 1 when Kevin Rudd became Prime Minister has just finished primary school, all under a Labor government and all under John Howard's unfair funding model. And so now we have the ludicrous situation where, as I said, at 5 minutes to midnight, we have now a much more hostile environment for public education with Conservative state premiers around the country. And we have a bill that still does not contain a new funding model. Still does not contain a new funding model. And if you were to ask, if a public school were to ask, or a parent were to ask, how much more will I get for my public school or for my student if this legislation passes, no one would know, because still there is no money put on the table to redress that massive disadvantage that has us ranking amongst the bottom of developed countries in terms of how much money we give schools. And even if this legislation were to pass, there's a clause in the legislation that says nothing in it is binding on the government. And so still, even if we vote for this and it passed today, it doesn't result in our public schools, who desperately need the money, getting one more cent. And what worries me is that we are now, having passed up years of opportunities where there was a really good environment to fix this, we are now in the increasingly heated environment of an election campaign where, as I've said, as the government looks around the states, it doesn't find many political friends, and we still do not have a funding model. And this is not a good time to be debating such a significant reform, because what history tells us is that in the heat of a fight, Labor gives in. Because we saw that with the mining tax. We saw with the mining tax that when one of the most significant reforms that could have set this country up for decades to come was recommended by Treasury under a $26 million advertising campaign, Labor caved into the big miners. We got a change of Prime Minister, and as a result the public purse is about $100 billion worse off over the next decade. And it probably is that, in part, Mr Deputy Speaker, that explains why we haven't yet seen any money put on the table, despite 5 odd years of government. And why, when it does come, if the reports are to be believed, it will be put off until the never-never. Because Labor has not had the courage to stand up to the big miners and raise the money we need to fund the services Australians expect, like decent public education for our kids. And so now we find ourselves speculating about when any money might arrive. And according to one report, if it does arrive, it won't be phased in until 2019. Now, by 2019, if we get the full $6 billion that's been tabled, by that stage we'll actually still be behind the OECD average, because of course the rest of the OECD will have increased their spending. But by 2019, that child that started when Kevin Rudd became Prime Minister will have finished high school without seeing the full benefits of the Gonski reform package. Because this is what happens when you do not have the courage to stand up in the public interest and say to the big miners, you have got to pay your fair share. It means that there is no money to pay for important reforms like this. And that is why I will be moving an amendment to this legislation to say, when the money does come in, given that it's probably going to come in dribs and drabs, the first lot of it should go to those disadvantaged public schools. Now, we know from the Gonski report that public schools are where you find the highest concentration of disadvantage. And as I go around and look at the schools in my electorate, that certainly rings true. But because the money is going to come in dribs and drabs, if we don't give it to those public schools first, they're going to fall further behind. And what it's also going to mean is that of a limited quantum of money that's well below what's needed, money will be going off to wealthy private schools who don't need it anywhere near as much, while the disadvantaged public schools continue to drag further and further behind. So this is a sensible amendment that says, look, if you're not going to pay for it all up front, then give it to those who need it most first. Now, if the government comes out and releases the funding formula to say, look, from tomorrow we're going to fund the Gonski recommendations fully, then there'd be no need to proceed with this amendment. But I reckon you can pretty safely bet that that's not going to happen. We are going to see funding promises put off to the never-never. And we are going to see years and years and years before public schools get the funding they deserve, and we're going to see, whatever happens at the election in September, the legacy of the unfair Howard model continuing because Labor was not willing to act when it could raise the money that we need to fund the services that Australians expect. What I'm also worried about is that delay after delay after delay potentially means that the decline in funding for public education and its consequences become irreversible. I read an article recently that suggested that in Victoria, whilst a majority of parents still send their children to public schools at the primary level, it's now changed in Victoria apparently, so that a majority of children are now at high school level going to non-government schools. And what I'm certainly finding from talking to people in Melbourne is that parents would love at the secondary level to send their kids to a government school. But they look around in their neighbourhoods and look at the government schools and they worry that they're underfunded at the high school level. And especially in areas like Flemington and Richmond, we have enormous disparities. We've got, as well as some very wealthy people, we've also got more public housing than any other electorate in the country. And so you have these schools who are trying to educate people from backgrounds of extreme disadvantage, as well as people who come from backgrounds of wealth. And of course, they get slugged when the Victorian Conservative government hacks away at public education, as it has done recently. And so they look at these schools and they say, well, we want to be guaranteed that our child will get a good quality public education, and we can look and we can see that you're struggling for funds. Maybe we'll look somewhere else. And that trend, there are some very good principals and school communities in Melbourne who are trying to reverse that trend and who are trying to make sure that the government secondary schools again become the school of choice for people to send their kids to. And I've done everything I can to support them in that. But one of the things they need is resources, and they need them now. Because if we don't give resources into these schools now, these kind of patterns of decisions that parents are making are just going to continue, and government schools are going to fall further and further behind unless we give them the resources to support what the parents and the school communities are doing to turn that around. Now, as a matter of basic principle, sure, people should be able to send their children to private school if they want to. Of course, it's not a matter of government to stand in the way of that. But it should never become a forced choice. It should never be a choice that a parent makes because they feel that the quality of education that they're going to receive at a public school is under a cloud. Do it if you want, but don't do it because you feel that government schools are falling behind. But unfortunately, what the Gonski report tells us is that we are at risk of that happening, and we are below the international average, and we need to act quickly. And so, if the government was serious, we would be putting in place a proper mining tax now so that we could have the money from next year to get our public schools up to the average of international developed countries. And I hope that in the lead up to the election, the government has the guts to do that. It would be an extraordinarily popular move amongst the Australian people. If you ask people, would you rather that we increase the taxes on the most wealthy companies in this country that send 83% of their profits overseas so that your children can have a good quality public education? Or would you rather that our public schools fall further and further behind and the government raises the taxes that the rest of us have to pay? I know what the majority of Australians would answer. But what that takes is a bit of guts. It takes the guts to stand up to the mining companies. The Greens have the guts to stand up to the mining companies and raise the revenue we need to fund the services that Australians expect. It's time the government got on with it, and if it is going to roll out funding in dribs and drabs, well, we will move an amendment to say give it not to those wealthy private schools that need it the least, but give it first to those schools in the public system where the greatest areas of disadvantage are.